Chapter 4. Cesarin finally returned home with the sunset. It had now been more than a day since he had slept. If he had left feeling tired, he had returned frazzled, fragile, utterly shattered by the day he had had. Neve and their child were not to be found in the hut. Momentary confusion had twisted into a sickening angst, jolting him into a frantic search, swiftly inside and out, eventually spotting them together at the far side of the garden. This expended what little of his spirit had remained. He couldn't face Neve, didn't have the strength of will left to explain everything that had happened that day. It was best she not see him like this. He had done his best to wash off the day's dirt, sweat, entrails and blood, before leaving his garments in the bucket to soak. It felt as though sleep had begun before he had laid down. Darkness had visited him in his dreams. First, as a young man, one amongst a group of naked bodies participating in an orgy spread about a furnished tar-brick chamber. He had left Val and a young woman behind, mutinous exhaustion, but apparently desperate to save his seed for another. Upon wading through the human cesspit, he came to a beautiful woman, her dark hair pasted to sweaty cheeks flushed red from exertion, and what looked like utter desolation on her face. She was propped up against the far wall. He had gently moved aside a filthy, chain-bound slave who knelt between her thighs, suckling, fingering, rubbing. They were now briefly jammed in a dark corner. He had cradled her off the ground, his hands wrapped around her buttocks, holding her still as his spine violently curved with the incessant, pounding contractions of his gluteals, back and forth as if desperately grasping for something just out of reach. She had wailed out at the room over his shoulder, a demon shrieking in resistance to its exorcism. He had finished inside of her, groaning on with each spasm of cum that he shot into her vaginal canal. His pelvis had convulsed, the strength left his body, and he had caved under the weight of his partner. They both ended up on the floor. The room stopped to watch. Slouched against the wall, he hid his face in shame. He had kept his forbidden love a secret, and now everyone knew it, had seen the desperate desire with which he had made love to and finished inside of her. Mollified by events, and the cold sober light in which trained eyes now objectified her, the woman had begun to cry, and ran from the chamber. Val had been too busy plumbing a young lady's anus to care for whatever had captured everyone's attention. But Cesarin knew that someone would surely relay what had taken place, inform him as to what exactly had been done to his newly wedded wife. He had faded out of sleep toward lucidity, rolled over to see that Neve had now come to bed, and was laying next to him. She lay on her back, head turned so he couldn't see her face. He had been surprised to find she wore nothing. Her breasts sloped down toward her armpits, revealing the intricate inkwork that decorated her sternum. It was a spindly design, a pattern that suggested the roots of a plant. He had only ever seen it when they made love. She otherwise kept it covered. Ink scored into the skin wound a narrow path down the centre of her ribcage, to disperse in all directions beneath her breastbone. Despite giving the immediate impression of the undergrowth of a tree, he found when examined closer the branching was too chaotic in its structure to be of any plant that he had ever seen. Similar then, but something else. Multiple root systems jumbled together, growing out of each other at random. He had asked her about it before, asked what it was supposed to symbolize. She had only ever given vague answers, told him that it required a lengthy explanation of her people, their culture and history, their systems of thought, the way they understood whatever it was that was being referred to whenever his people invoked the idea of understanding or of knowing, the consequences this then had for the logic underlying her people's language, and how that fed back into the ways the world was understood or spoken about. All of this as a preliminary introduction, just for it to merely begin to make sense. She had said that the closest to an explanation she could provide was for him to think of it as a representation of reality, attempting to render an understanding of what is taken to be reality. A grunt and a wry smile. "I'm happy I've left all that behind, though," was how she had laid the conversation to rest last time he brought it up. He had said nothing in response, hadn't pursued the markings any further after that. He studied it now, tracing along one of many curling networks as it split and twisted among the other threads. In the dim light, it seemed as though the surrounding branches gently shifted whenever he focused in, coming to life in the periphery of his gaze as he followed the path of a particular thread within the larger pattern. but when he regarded the inky shape as a whole, it was obviously static, just a beautiful design, etched in unbelievable detail onto the body of his wife. From the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a shape move in the doorway, something watching him. He slowly turned his head, inexplicably expecting to see his baby child manifest before him. There was no shape, however. His eyes fixed the empty threshold, narrowing. He finally exhaled. When his gaze returned to the bed, he found Neve looking up at him. Only she had no face. Her features had all been smoothed over. He had then been strolling the tar brick defensive perimeter along the outside border. The land their settlement lay claim to was demarcated by a hulking wall built off the edge of a small cliff, so that what looked like a structure of 4 or 5 lengths from the tar tap side proved to be closer to 40 or 50 from the outside. As a boy, he was told stories of its construction, and of the small defensive detachment that had been positioned to watch over the border. This was prior to the realization that the sheer size of the wall itself would be an insoluble obstacle. On his periodical scouts, Suzuran often contemplated the trees below. The size of the perimeter wall would provide protection until such a time as the trees grew beyond its height. That might not be for another 50 or 100 years. Still, it would eventually come to pass. The evening had immediately set in, dense fog rolling in over the darkening treetops. On the horizon, distant forest was awash in a fiery glow, and thick plumes of smoke could be seen rising to meld with the inky black above. He had apparently seen something within the foliage on the forest edge, and had begun to descend the wall. To his surprise, he had not been alone on the perimeter wall, but had charge of a small garrison. Although no one looked down upon his progress, so he supposed he hadn't been able to find anyone to assist him. When he reached the ground, he found that the rope did not detract back up to safety as expected, but that he was surprisingly satisfied to leave it awaiting his return. The forest glistened in a way he had never seen before. Little rainbows bordered the edges of things. The air smelled sweet. He could hear gentle music nearby. A small circle of cloaked men sat around a fire. He supposed they might be druids. One played a stringed instrument. The others intoned a softly spoken incantation. Suzuran watched from a distance. One of the cloaked figures would occasionally take a handful of plant matter from a cloth bag and throw it on the fire. The little rainbows would become increasingly vibrant each time. Another small bag was brought out and passed around the circle as the song continued. They each in turn took a small piece of a plant that he did not recognize and sat it in their mouths. He found he was now part of their circle. As he held up the peculiar plant he had taken from the bag, he wondered if this was the sort of plant that might have a root system similar to the image on Neve's chest, but quickly chased the thought away, reminding himself that it didn't actually have anything to do with any sort of tree. The circle of druids were all facing him now, as if examining his train of thought, or possibly just waiting for him to put the offering in his mouth. He did. They sat in silence. Nothing happened for a very long time. The fire had almost burnt out when one of the hooded circle broke off toward the shadows. Another of the druids threw several more handfuls on the fire, suddenly illuminating their surrounds. Mesmerized, he found the rainbow pattern imbued everything now. The stringed instrument had begun to pluck a looping phrase, hypnotic in its repetition. A new vocal incantation had also begun, more insistent than the first. The druid returned from the shadows. He dragged 2 bound figures behind him, a boy and a girl. The chanting became more intense. Another of the figures rose from the circle to help deliver the writhing prisoners. Suzuran was overcome by a terrible feeling. He could guess what was about to happen. He remembered the rope he had left. All of a sudden he became aware of several giant hordes streaming toward the perimeter wall. He tried to move. His body was completely stricken. As the group had come upon the light of the fire, and the faces of the bound sacrifices were revealed to the circle, he had begun to rage within his inert shell, screaming inside of himself, screeching until his throat was bloody. It did no good. Helpless, he watched the druid throw Raworan on the fire. The boy's terrified eyes locked into his. He cried out in fearful pain, initially begging to be saved, but very quickly just screaming in terror as his skin bubbled and blackened, then finally split open and began to curl. The moans issuing from the charred face became muted as the flames incinerated the boy's throat and lungs. Cezurin was now looking at the ceiling of his bedroom. He lay in a pool of brine. He looked at the door. This time his child was in the doorway. He saw that it was a figment, a smoky mist taking on the shape of his baby. It slowly floated toward them. It drifted along Neve's body and dispersed to enter her face through her mouth, nose and eyes.